Greetings, everyone. I'm Eric Mackey, and I'm one of your trainers for DESE's PBIS Academy. This video is focused on teaching your school-wide expectations to both teachers and students. The content for this video was developed by the Center on PBIS and Northeast PBIS. In this video, we'll discuss the fourth getting started step, which is to develop procedures for teaching your school-wide expectations. As a team, your responsibilities will be to develop a plan for how your lessons will be developed and how teachers and students will be engaged in the teaching process. By now, you should hopefully have a team established that is meeting at least monthly. Your team should have a brief and clear statement of purpose that helps to focus your team and to delineate it from other teams within your building. And at this point, your team should have drafted your school's 3 to 5 core values. If you haven't already, please be sure to gather feedback from your fellow staff, your students, and your families to make sure that the values you've identified as a team resonate with your broader school community. This is one of the ways that we make sure that your PBIS framework is culturally relevant. Once these first 3 steps are accomplished, we'll take those values and identify what those values look like within each context, such as what does it look like to be safe, respectful, and responsible within the classroom, in the gym, or in the hallways. Once we've identified those clear, observable behaviors, usually through the development of what we call a matrix, we then develop lessons and schedules to teach those lessons so that both staff and students know what is expected of them and how they can be successful on a day-to-day basis. Though it may be somewhat novel to teach social skills or social behaviors, the process of how to teach those behaviors is no different than what we would do for math, science, or art. You may have your own variation on this, but generally teaching involves identifying the desired skill or competency, modeling how the student should perform that skill, providing the student with opportunities to practice that skill, providing feedback on how well the student performs a skill, maybe with a smile, a check mark, or suggestions as to how the student can perform the task more accurately, adjusting how you teach the skill based on your student's performance, and restarting the cycle for the next skill in the progression. It's the same process for teaching social behavior. So for the first step in the teaching cycle, we want to be sure to clearly define what we want students and teachers to do in order to enact the values of your school community. A helpful way to organize these ideas is through what we like to call a matrix. You'll hear us use this term a lot through the Academy. As you can see in this matrix, this school has identified their school values as being respect to self, respect to others, and respect to property. They're identified on the left-hand side going down the column. Across the top are their settings or contexts, such as the classroom, the playground, the gym, and the hallway. These are the areas where students and staff will be following the expectations. They're broken down into distinct contexts as the expectations may differ slightly based on that particular context. Within the inner boxes are the concrete, observable behaviors that students can do in order to show the values within the context. For instance, in order to show respect for self within the hallway, students should walk. In order to respect others within the hallway, students should walk to the right and use a normal voice volume. Some schools even use a voice level thermometer to make this even more clear, such as a 0 for silence, a 1 for whisper, and so forth. This matrix provides your team with the bones of your social skills lessons. Again, make sure that once you feel that your matrix is good enough, be sure to share it with your school community, such as your fellow staff, your students, and parents, for feedback before rolling it out officially. The Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide offers helpful strategies for gathering school community feedback to increase the chance that your expectations, your values, and behaviors are culturally relevant to your school's culture. Once you've developed your matrix, you then want to identify how you're going to teach those expectations. Just like with academics, we want to teach the behaviors for each context, like the hallway or the gym, and do that explicitly. We want to provide examples of how to perform the behaviors as well as non-examples of what the behavior should not look like. We want to actively involve students in the lesson through games, role plays, and so forth, so that you can assess their understanding. And we want to provide lots of time to practice the expectations within the context where they're supposed to be performed, like walking at arm's distance along the hallway. Based on the feedback you gather from your school community, you may learn that the expectations that you create for school may not be necessarily in sync with the values that your students and parents have at home. If so, your team will need to think critically about those values that you've identified, considering which rules you've developed could be adapted to align with students' values at home and which values need to stay firm. For instance, some communities frown upon snitching or telling authorities if rules are being broken. In schools, we expect students to let us know if rules are being broken or if they're about to be broken. If there's a discordance between home and community expectations with your school's expectations, you'll need to be clear with students and teachers as to why that particular rule is in place and provide additional opportunities for practice. So how do we equip teachers to teach these social skill lessons? Well, with a lesson plan, of course, just like we'd have a lesson plan for any of our academics. A lesson plan is a guide to teachers as to how the skill should be taught. Ideally, it includes teaching strategies, examples, means for engaging students, means for assessing progress, and providing feedback. You'll pull much of that information you need directly from the teaching matrix. Please note, these lessons do not need to be long and drawn out. Some may only take about 10 or 15 minutes, but they do need to include explicit practice within the context where the behaviors are supposed to be performed, such as sitting quietly in the library or carefully putting back instruments for a science class. Many schools have their own templates for lesson plans, and that's great, that's fine. If your school has a logical, easy to use lesson plan format, use those. However, if you're looking for ideas for lesson plan formats or even the content, feel free to check out the exemplar repository on the NEPBIS website. Just please remember that your PBIS products should be adapted to your school. Once we've taught the rule, we want to prompt the use of the behavior. Again, this is just like academics. If we want students to write an essay, we might remind them that we expect them to write a 5-paragraph essay. That provides students with their guidelines and helps to jog their memory as to what you expect of them. It's just the same with behavior. Before the moment when you want a behavior to occur, provide a reminder, or what behaviorists like to call pre-corrections. Reminders or pre-corrections are incredibly helpful when you know that misbehavior or a behavioral error is likely to occur. This is a way to get ahead of that undesirable behavior and give your students an additional opportunity to be successful. Just as reminders are helpful within the moment, it's also helpful to plan your reminders as a practice. Think of the times in the year when behaviors start to fray, such as after long breaks. Plan on providing those pre-corrections then. Once we've taught students the behaviors that we want to see and reminded them of those expectations, it's then time to monitor them to see if they perform the behavior correctly. To do so, we need to actively supervise students. This includes moving around the classroom, scanning around the room every once in a while, and interacting with students. Through active supervision, you can acknowledge the students who are performing the behaviors as you like, such as, I like how Juan and Jenna are using quiet voices right now, or providing corrective feedback to those who may be making some form of behavioral errors, such as, Mark, this isn't a time for side conversations. We're doing an individual activity right now. Please focus on your own work. That might be an example of that corrective feedback. Once the lessons are taught, you'll want to evaluate how students are responding to those lessons, just as you would for an ELA or math lesson. What are they doing correctly? Where are the errors? If your students are making errors, try to take data on who is making the errors. Is the whole classroom struggling, a few students, or just an individual? Where are the behavioral errors happening? And what kind of errors are they making, such as are they being too loud, being out of their seat, not asking for permission, and so forth? With such information, you can determine an efficient strategy to address the errors, such as maybe reteaching the expectations to your entire class, or a small group, or an individual. The tracking of such errors will require you to use or develop some form of easy to use tracking system that will help you to identify patterns, correct them in real time. While taking note of whether students are following rules or making behavioral errors, we also want to make sure that the adults are doing what they're supposed to be doing. If we're seeing notable behavioral errors, our first question should be whether the adults have done what we've asked them to do, including teaching the lessons, monitoring, and providing feedback. If those pieces aren't in place, then we're not teaching to fidelity. We need to correct the fidelity before we think about problem solving around student behavior. We'll be walking you through some strategies for measuring fidelity, but as soon as you develop your lessons, think about how you can measure whether the lessons have been taught and when booster sessions may be necessary. Once you have means to measure student social behavior and the fidelity of adult practices, you can then summarize that data and use that data to determine next steps. We've gone over a few of these guidelines for teaching expectations already, but to highlight a few, don't start from scratch. If your school or another school within your district has lessons that have worked for them already, use or adapt those. Also, make sure that the behaviors you identify for your matrix are phrased positively and can easily be taught and measured. Also, be sure to create a schedule and mechanisms for teaching the expectations to the teachers. Just like the students, they'll need direct instruction, practice, monitoring, feedback, and acknowledgement to be successful in providing those lessons. And create a schedule for teaching and reviewing the lessons throughout the year to help build fluency and sustain a positive climate. The example here is of a school that used the strategy of using stations to teach the expectations. When using stations, students go to a particular station within a context like the hallway or the cafeteria, where an individual reviews the lesson with them. To start, it's usually a PBIS team member who hosts each station, but the hope is that that teaching will then shift to the teachers. Other schools have the teachers provide the lessons themselves. The important point here is to explicitly plan when the lessons will be taught and by whom. So as a team, please review the guidelines for teaching expectations. Draft a social skill lesson for one box, row, or column of your matrix using the template. Discuss how the lessons will be taught, such as will it be taught by the PBIS team members, maybe in stations, by teachers within their classroom and within those contexts, or maybe by students, especially if you're within a high school context. Then identify how you'll get feedback from staff and families on your lessons. Then finally, create drafts of your lesson plans for your key locations and send them to us via the Canvas system. Thank you for taking the time to review this video focused on teaching your school-wide expectations. Please feel free to reach out to your trainers if you have any questions or would like support in completing your team tasks. Take care. Thank you very much.